In the Bible, few peoples have a relationship as conflicted and yet as close with Israel as the Moabites. Throughout the Old Testament, we see them as neighbors, as enemies, and as a constant source of spiritual problems for the chosen people. Their history is filled with battles, alliances, and persistent hostility. But to truly understand the Moabites, we must go to their origin, which is one of the most shocking and problematic in all of Scripture. Their story does not begin with the founding of a great city or the feat of a heroic king. It begins in the aftermath of one of God's most terrible judgments, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The origin of the Moabite people is directly tied to Lot, Abraham's nephew, and to a desperate and sinful act committed in a cave after fleeing the catastrophe. This foundation, born of sin and shame, marked the destiny of the Moabites and their relationship with God and with Israel. In fact, the very law of Moses would later establish a very severe prohibition against them, preventing them from becoming part of God's people. However, and here lies one of the greatest and least understood mysteries of the Old Testament. How is it possible that a woman from this forbidden people was not only accepted, but ended up becoming a central figure in the genealogy of King David and, by extension, in the lineage of Jesus Christ himself? Today, we are going to examine the complete story of the Moabites, from their dark origin to their unexpected role in the plan of salvation. What we will discover will teach us a profound lesson about how God can work in mysterious ways and how His grace can transform even the most problematic past to fulfill His eternal purposes. After escaping the terrible destruction of Sodom, Lot and his 2 daughters were afraid to stay in the small town of Zoar. So, they went up to the mountains and took refuge in a cave. They were alone, isolated from the world, and their future was completely uncertain. They had lost their home, their fiancés, and their mother, who had turned into a pillar of salt. It was in this environment of despair and isolation that Lot's daughters, whose view of the world had been deeply affected by the corruption they had seen in Sodom, made a terrible decision. Chapter 19 of the book of Genesis tells us their reasoning. The older daughter said to the younger,
"Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to join with us as is the custom. Come, let us give our father wine to drink, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our father's descendants."
They believed, in their logic twisted by trauma and isolation, that there was no other way for their family to survive. So, for 2 consecutive nights, they made their father Lot drunk, and without him fully realizing what he was doing, each of them lay with him. From this incestuous union, 2 sons were born who would become the fathers of 2 nations. Genesis 19:37 says, "And the firstborn bore a son, and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day." The younger daughter also had a son, whom she named Ben-Ami, the father of the Ammonites. Thus, the Moabite people were not born of a divine promise or a blessing, as was the case with Israel and Abraham. Their origin is marked by an act of sin, deceit, and shame occurring in the darkness of a cave. This problematic beginning is no small detail. It is the very foundation of their identity, and would define much of their future history and their tense and often hostile relationship with their relatives, the Israelites. Over time, the descendants of Moab became an established nation, the Moabites. When the Israelites, after their long journey through the desert, arrived at the borders of the Promised Land, they encountered this neighboring people. But instead of a welcome, they found fear and hostility. The Bible shows us that the Moabites tried to destroy Israel in two very different ways. First with spiritual attacks, and then with moral seduction. The first strategy is found in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 to 24. Balak, the king of Moab, upon seeing the immense people of Israel camped on his borders, was filled with absolute terror. Instead of confronting them in a direct military battle, he decided to use a weapon he considered more powerful, a curse. To do so, he hired the services of a famous seer of the time, a man named Balaam, promising him great riches if he would come and curse the people of Israel. Balaam tried to fulfill the task, but he encountered a problem: the God of Israel. In one of the strangest stories in the Bible, the donkey Balaam was riding even spoke to warn him that an angel of God was blocking his path. This shows us God's total control over the situation. 3 times Balak took Balaam to different mountains with views of the Israelite camp to curse them. And 3 times, when Balaam opened his mouth to pronounce the curse, only words of blessing and prophecies in favor of Israel came out. God himself twisted the words of the seer, demonstrating that no human curse could touch the people he was protecting. Having failed to curse Israel directly, the Moabites, advised by Balaam himself, turned to a much more subtle and dangerous tactic. If they couldn't defeat them from the outside, they would try to corrupt them from the inside. Numbers 25 tells us the tragic story of Baal-peor. The text says that the men of Israel began to involve themselves with the Moabite women. These women invited them to the sacrifices of their gods, and the Israelites not only accepted, but ate from the offerings and bowed to worship their god, Baal of Peor. They fell into the trap of idolatry and immorality. God's reaction was immediate and terrible. His anger was kindled against Israel, and a deadly plague began to spread throughout the camp, killing thousands of people. The plague only stopped when a faithful priest, Phinehas, acted zealously to purify the camp of sin. This episode showed that the greatest danger to Israel was not always the enemy armies, but the seduction of idolatry and immorality, which could destroy their relationship with God. Thus, the Moabites established themselves not only as a military adversary, but as a constant spiritual threat, a people whose influence could lead Israel to ruin. And these hostile actions would have a direct and very severe consequence in the very law of God. The actions of the Moabites, their hostility in trying to curse Israel, and their success in corrupting them morally at Baal-peor had a very serious and lasting consequence. It was not just a bad memory in the history of Israel. It became a specific law, a divine decree that would establish a formal barrier between the Moabites and the people of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 3, we find this compelling law. God, through Moses, commands,
"An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever."
This is an incredibly strong prohibition. "They shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord" meant that they could not be considered part of the covenant people, and they could not fully participate in the communal and religious life of Israel. And the phrase, "even to their 10th generation, forever," emphasized that this was not a temporary measure, but a perpetual separation. The Bible itself explains why this law was so severe. Verse 4 continues saying,
"Because they did not come to meet you with bread and water on the way, when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired Balaam against you, to curse you.
God did not forget their lack of hospitality, and, above all, their malicious attempt to use a spiritual curse to destroy his people. From a faith perspective, this law was not an act of whim or hatred by God. It was, first of all, a direct consequence of Moab's hostile actions. And secondly, it was a protective measure for Israel. God was setting a clear boundary to protect the spiritual purity and integrity of his people, keeping them away from the idolatrous and corrupting influence of their neighbors. So, with this divine law, the fate of the Moabites seemed sealed. They were marked by their shameful origin, by their hostility, and now by a law that excluded them forever from the covenant community. The door to heaven seemed to have been closed for them. It seemed like a closed case, a final separation decreed by the very hand of God. But as we will see, God's plan is always bigger, more mysterious, and much more merciful than any law could suggest by itself, because it is right in the middle of this story of rejection and separation where God was going to plant the seed of one of the most beautiful redemption stories in all of the Bible. For centuries, the law in Deuteronomy seemed to be the final word on the Moabites, a closed door, an eternal separation. But God's plan is much deeper than our literal interpretations of the law. And to prove this, in one of the darkest and most chaotic periods of Israel's history, the time of the Judges, he tells us a story that seems to come from another world, a story of love, loyalty, and redemption. It is the story of Ruth, the Moabite. The story, which we find in the book of Ruth, begins with irony. Due to a great famine in Bethlehem, the house of bread, an Israelite family led by a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, does the unthinkable. They go to seek refuge in the land of Moab, the forbidden land. There, their two sons marry Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. But tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies, and soon after, their two sons die as well, leaving Naomi alone, a widow without children in a foreign land, accompanied only by her two Moabite daughters-in-law. Upon hearing that the famine in her land had ended, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem. With a generous but broken heart, she told her daughters-in-law to return to their families in Moab so they could marry again and have a future. Orpah, crying, kissed her mother-in-law and said goodbye. It was the logical and understandable decision. But Ruth clung to Naomi and refused to leave her. And here, in Ruth's response, we find one of the most beautiful declarations of faith and loyalty in all the Bible. She says to Naomi, and we read this in Ruth, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17.
Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death separates me from you.
Let's carefully analyze these words. This is much more than the affection of a daughter-in-law for her mother-in-law. Ruth, the Moabite, is making a covenant. She is renouncing her land, her people, and most importantly, her gods, such as Chemosh, to embrace the people of Israel, and above all, to accept the one true God, Yahweh, as her God. It is a total conversion, an act of faith that springs from a heart transformed by the love and testimony she saw in her Israelite family. With this decision, Ruth, the foreigner from the forbidden people, voluntarily chose to join the people of the covenant. not by her bloodline, but by a decision of faith in her heart. And so, the two widows, Naomi, the Israelite woman embittered by life, and Ruth, the Moabite woman filled with new faith, set out together on the road back to Bethlehem. They didn't know what awaited them, but Ruth's act of loyalty had set in motion a divine plan that would break all barriers and change the history of salvation forever. Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem with Naomi raises a very important question. If the law of God in Deuteronomy was so clear in prohibiting the Moabites from entering the congregation of Israel, how is it possible that this story not only happens, but is celebrated in the Bible? The answer to this paradox is one of the most beautiful lessons about the heart of God, the mystery of grace. The law of Deuteronomy was a wall of protection for Israel, a consequence of the hostility and corruption of the Moabite nation as a whole. But it was not necessarily an inescapable genetic curse for every individual. What God looks at, above all, is the heart. And Ruth's heart had changed. Her declaration of faith saying, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God," was an act of genuine conversion. She ceased to be a Moabite in the spiritual sense and joined the people of the covenant through her personal faith. When they arrived in Bethlehem, her virtuous character and loyalty to Naomi caught the attention of a good and respected man named Boaz, who turned out to be a close relative of Naomi's family. In the Israelite law, there was a very special figure called the kinsman redeemer, a relative who had the sacred duty to care for and protect his relatives who were in trouble, such as redeeming their land or marrying a widow to preserve the family name. Boaz saw Ruth's faith and virtue and decided to act as her redeemer. He married her, thus restoring the honor and future of Naomi and of Ruth herself. This act of redemption brought Ruth, the foreigner, to be a full and blessed part of the community of Israel. From the perspective of our faith, this story is much more than a beautiful romance. Ruth is what we call a type or a foreshadowing of the church. She, being a Gentile, a non-Jew, represents all the nations of the world who were not part of the original covenant with Israel. And Boaz, the Redeemer, acts as a figure of Christ. Just as Boaz redeemed Ruth and made her his wife, Christ, our Redeemer, rescues us, the church, made up of people from all nations, and makes us his bride, including us in the family of God, not by our merits or our origin, but by pure grace. Through our faith in him, God's reaction was immediate and terrible. His anger was kindled against Israel, and a deadly plague began to spread throughout the camp, killing thousands of people. The plague only stopped when a faithful priest, Phinehas, acted zealously to purify the camp of sin. This episode showed that the greatest danger to Israel was not always the enemy armies, but the seduction of idolatry and immorality, which could destroy their relationship with God. Thus, the Moabites established themselves not only as a military adversary, but as a constant spiritual threat, a people whose influence could lead Israel to ruin. And these hostile actions would have a direct and very severe consequence in the very law of God. The actions of the Moabites, their hostility in trying to curse Israel, and their success in corrupting them morally at Baal Peor had a very serious and lasting consequence. It was not just a bad memory in the history of Israel. It became a specific law, a divine decree that would establish a formal barrier between the Moabites and the people of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 3, we find this compelling law. God, through Moses, commands, and so we have completed our journey through the hidden history of the Moabites. We began in the darkness of a cave, with a nation born of shame and despair. We saw how they grew as a proud and hostile people, a neighbor that tried to curse and corrupt Israel. We remembered the severe law of God that seemed to put an eternal barrier between them and the people of the covenant. The fate of Moab seemed sealed by their origin and actions. But then, in the midst of the darkness, God ignited a light of hope in the most unexpected place, the heart of a Moabite woman named Ruth. Her unwavering faith, her loyalty, and her decision to embrace the God of Israel changed everything. The story of Ruth teaches us the most important lesson in all of the Bible. God's grace is infinitely more powerful than our past, our laws, and our curses. The sin of a cave seemed to define the fate of an entire people, but the faith of one woman in a barley field changed the course of the history of salvation forever. The law of God is holy and just, and it shows us his standard of perfection and the consequences of sin. But the case of Ruth reveals to us that God has always valued a converted heart and sincere faith over any origin or nationality. She shows us that God does not judge nations as one inseparable block, but that his mercy is always available to the individual who turns to him with humility. Thank you for joining us on this journey to discover the surprising story of the Moabites. If you want to continue delving into the stories of redemption and the hidden truths of the Bible, I invite you to watch one of the 2 videos that are now appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that we can continue discovering the infinite richness of our faith together. May God bless you, and until next time.